No? Okay. So I want to thank Sakıp Sakancı Center for Turkish Studies for this invitation, and Professors Zeynep Çelik and Tunç Şen for this kind invitation for organizing this conference. So the proclamation of the Republic of Turkey in 1923 was an important milestone for the Turkish society. We all know this. But the story of Armenian community is quite different. During the wartime, thousands of Armenians were deported from Anatolian towns and villages, which resulted in the Armenian genocide in 1915. Those who survived in the Syrian deserts eventually migrated to the Western countries, and some of Armenians in Istanbul, they stayed in Istanbul, and the Armenian community transformed into a tiny minority, quote-unquote minority community, now centered in Istanbul. So today I'm going to talk about those Armenians who stayed in Istanbul and became a part of the Republic of Turkey after 1923. The demands of Armenians and Greeks for self-determination during the Armistice years made them quote-unquote traitors and fifth column in the eyes of Turkish ruling elite, intellectuals, and public. When the Turkish national movement, led by Mustafa Kemal, consolidated its power in the Anatolian Peninsula and declared the establishment of Republic of Turkey in 1923, the remaining non-Muslim populations that remained within the borders of this new Turkey were viewed with suspicion. The Armistice image of non-Muslims celebrating a foreign occupation persisted. It would become a major justification used for the Turkish nationalists when seeking Muslim support for targeting minority groups in early Republican years. So in this paper, I argue that during the early Republican years, when the issue of minority populations became a topic of debate, there was quote-unquote an armistice complex within the Turkish ruling elite, intellectuals, and wider public. This armistice complex, a response to the political activities and collaboration of Armenians and Greeks with Allied occupation, portrays these communities within the newly established republic as quote-unquote potential threats. They had to be isolated, kept under surveillance, and their loyalty to the republic constantly tested to protect the territorial integrity and national identity. So this armistice complex that I argue is a version of the Sèvres syndrome, referring to the 1920 Treaty of Sèvres, which ceded large parts of Ottoman territories to Allied powers and created large zones of Allied occupation within the Ottoman Empire. It reflects a popular belief in Turkey that Western powers want to weaken and partition the Turkish state. Both comprise images and beliefs about threat of homogeneous Turkish nation. So how the Armenian leadership and dailies reacted against the nationalist state policies, how education and identity policies of the nationalist regime affected the life of post-genocide Armenian community. I answer these questions through providing examples of political responses of Armenian community, as well as the Armenian press, in response to state policies, and assess whether these efforts brought any good for the community in the early Republican years. I first explain the emergence of the Turkish national identity and how non-Muslim citizens of the Republic were excluded from the boundaries of national identity. In the subsequent slides, to understand Armenians' responses to the state's education and identity policies, I focus on material from Armenian and Turkish press sources. So these discriminatory and nationalist practices of the early Republican years demonstrate that even though Armenian community put efforts to actively respond to political developments, their efforts fell short in securing basic democratic rights. So Building a nation state from the Ottoman Empire's wreckage rested upon many inclusions and exclusions. From the outset, the leaders of Turkish national movement, Milli Hareket, made it clear that they envisioned Turkey as a nation of Muslims who resided on the Anatolian Peninsula. The non-Muslim populations were excluded from the outset when it was decided that they could not take part in the first parliament as deputies. Even though nationalists' proclaimed ideal was secular republic based on civic principles, where citizens, regardless of their ethnic and religious background, were regarded as equal members of the nation, religion was still the main pillar of Turkish national identity, providing the basis for drawing boundaries between communities. To unite the diverse non-Turkish Muslim populations under the umbrella of Republic of Turkey, the nationalist elite tactically cast the new national boundaries widely to include all the Muslim groups under a Turkish umbrella identity, while selectively omitting the non-Muslim communities such as Greeks, Armenians, and Jews. In other words, the boundaries of Republic's Turkish nation became a republican version of the Ottoman Empire's Millet-i Hakime ruling nation, which had been the Muslims of the empire. Non-Muslims millets of the empire, however, were not embraced as part of the new national identity and became subject to extreme surveillance and what I call loyalty tests. It was in education especially that discriminatory state policies targeted those non-Muslim communities left within Turkey. The nationalist elite viewed non-Muslim schools as an obstacle to the assimilation of young generations, or acculturation, let's say. Because the preservation of the Armenian identity was closely attached to church and community schools, the nationalist authorities aimed at controlling these institutions by introducing new regulations. The closure of Armenian schools in Istanbul would have resulted in the assimilation of the community in the subsequent decades, with young generations forgetting their language and culture. Being aware of this, the community leadership, directors, and educators of these Armenian schools voiced their concerns, yet their actions were not sufficient while dealing with discriminatory policies. The government turned its attention first to the non-Muslim and French, German, and American private schools in Istanbul, focusing on the Turkification of their curricula. This entailed increasing Turkish language, history, culture classes for non-Muslim students and decreasing the native and foreign language classes. None of the European countries that signed the Treaty of Lausanne, including France, England, Italy, and Greece, none of them objected to these state practices. Teachers of Turkish language, history, and geography courses will be assigned by the central government in Ankara, but the salaries of these teachers will be paid by the schools themselves with no state support. Having achieved no resolution, the directors of the Armenian schools, they co-signed a petition requesting the government to either pay the salaries of Turkish teachers from the state budget or to provide financial assistance to the Armenian schools. This was perhaps one of the first official appeals of the Armenian community to the state authorities during the early Republican years. In addition to imposing more Turkish education, the Directorate of Education assigned investigators who visited schools, Armenian schools regularly, searching for quote-unquote dangerous books and maps, ordering the removal of religious symbols from the walls, and meeting with Turkish teachers to discuss the progress in implementing the state-approved curriculum. The state forbade any non-Turkish nationalist symbolism. For example, students' clothing also monitored and controlled. Hats depicting national colors, for example, red, blue, and orange in Armenian schools, and white and blue in Greek schools were banned. Teaching materials used by Armenian teachers during Armenian language and religious classes were also scrutinized, with any text implying the existence of an Armenian national identity prohibited. School ceremonies too were observed by the inspectors to verify if the Turkish national holidays were being celebrated by the students, quote-unquote, enthusiastically. The state's Turkification measures focused on instructors and school administrators as much as on the students. The Directorate of Education required that all Armenian, Greek, and Jewish teachers take an exam on the Turkish language and history, including those who had passed the exam previously and earned their teaching certificate. In announcing this requirement, the Directorate of Education announced that the new iteration of the exam would be more difficult, and those who failed would lose their positions as teachers and directors at non-Muslim schools. The teaching licenses of some Armenian and Greek science teachers who didn't pass the exams, testing them on material outside on their expertise, were revoked. All the directors of non-Muslim and French foreign schools were given a one-year period to learn Turkish and pass written and oral examinations on Turkish language skills. Those who failed these examinations were dismissed from their positions, and after failing the test, they were not able to teach at these schools. Another topic that the early republic, imposed pressure on the Armenian minority community in Istanbul was the travel ban. So, as scholars Lerna Ekmekçioğlu and Halil Sucihan show, due to the agitations of the Turkish press and nationalist policies introduced by the government, the Armenian community found itself in a precarious atmosphere in which the burden rested on them to prove the Turkish state and society that they were quote-unquote loyal citizens of the Republic of Turkey. So in this section, I will provide discursive examples from Turkish papers and the reactions of Armenian community to these distressing publications. By doing this, I will argue that the Armenian community's precarious situation in the face of rising nationalism led the leadership to make public statements to exceed state policies and to try to prove the community's loyalty. Supi Nuri, a writer for the İleri newspaper, set his sights on the non-Muslim communities of the newly established Turkish state as early as December 1923, claiming that the non-Muslims were revolting, baş kaldırmak, and not being loyal to the Republic. His remarks embody the spirit of state policies. I quote, "After winning the war, our duty has not come to an end. We should not rest. See the situation of the minorities today. What was their situation when we took back Izmir? Then they were afraid, their faces changed color, some put hats on their head, some fled the country or started to inform authorities against their friends. Today, the situation has changed. Now they are returning from abroad. The government should closely survey Armenians and Greeks, not to allow them to open their eyes. The government should implement decisive policies against the Greeks, Jews, and Armenians," end quote. Just as Supi Nuri had demanded, surveillance of Armenians, Greeks, and Jews was implemented by the state during the first years of the Republic. Since the Armistice experience was so fresh, the majority of Turkish intellectuals and political figures believed that Armenians, Greeks, and Jews were quote-unquote collaborators of the foreign powers. It was because of this mindset that non-Muslims who left for abroad during the final years of the Armistice period were not allowed by the Republican regime to return to the newly established Turkey. Although the Republic's constitution and the provisions of the Treaty of Lausanne guaranteed equal rights to Armenians as Turkish citizens, a travel ban was imposed on Armenian citizens. No Armenian from Istanbul was allowed to travel outside of the city limits. Similarly, Armenians were prohibited from traveling to Istanbul from Anatolia. Armenian merchants who traveled from Anatolia to Istanbul were not allowed to return their villages. Even Armenians residing in neighborhoods such as Pendik, Kartal, and Maltepe, modern-day Istanbul towns located on the Anatolian side, they were not allowed to travel to Istanbul, even if they worked or had businesses inside the city. Even though the representatives of the community leadership, such as Armenian Patriarchate and the head of Civic Council, Armenian Civic Council, wanted to show the community's loyalty, quote-unquote loyalty, with a pro-state approach, some Armenian intellectuals did criticize state policies. For example, an editorial published in Joburtitsain, the Voice of People newspaper, commented on states' contradictory promises. The paper, according to the paper, the primary aim of this travel ban was to control and surveil the Armenian population to prevent them returning from their native towns and villages in Anatolia. As a first step in trying to prove their people's loyalty, the Armenian leadership decided to renounce the rights that was granted by the Treaty of Lausanne, especially the Article 42nd of Treaty of Lausanne. The first clause was related to family law because there was a thought among government officials that Turkish state would embrace the secular and democratic civil code. The Armenian leadership believed that the rights related to the family law would be not necessary. Even though this renouncement was related to the family law in particular, it was presented by the Association of Turkish Armenian Fraternity as a general renouncement of Armenians' minority rights. Ömer Aziz Bey, a representative of the Association of Turkish Armenian Fraternity, paid a visit to İsmet Pasha to inform him that Armenian community, including clergymen and the civic council and foundations, had agreed to renounce the rights given by the Treaty of Lausanne, and they were ready to be quote-unquote Turks. In similar lines, Azniv Aharonyan, an official from the Armenian Patriarchate, he gave an interview to the Cumhuriyet Daily, Republic Daily, asserting that Armenians were quote-unquote 100% poor Turks. He insisted that, again, quote-unquote, Armenians were Turks but not Muslims, end quote. And the Armenian community were ready to fully follow the orders of the state. As the Patriarchate's official, Azniv Aharonyan, described the Armenian community as, quote-unquote, following the orders of state and as being complete loyalty and pure Turks, these three phrases directly reflected the conditions that the nationalist regime placed on non-Muslim communities. They were asked to demonstrate their loyalty and follow the state's orders to eradicate Armistice image of non-Muslim populations. So did the leadership's pro-state moves bring any positive development for the Armenian community? An immediate response came from Tevhid Unity paper, Turkish language paper. In its editorial, the paper reacted to the Patriarchate's statements with harsh criticism. According to the Daily, non-Muslims were, quote-unquote, the greatest pragmatists who allied with themselves with the British, French, and Italians. Therefore, non-Muslims' claims that they were poor Turks was merely a self-satisfying show. While the state's constitution guaranteed equal rights for all citizens, the newspapers contend that it was not possible to trust the non-Muslim communities. The article concluded in terms of manifesting the Armistice complex. I quote, the Patriarchate official, Azniv Efendi, stated on behalf of the Armenian community and the Patriarchate that Armenians are 100% poor Turks. Now, don't you have a right to question this statement? Azniv Efendi, where were you 5 years ago? So, another influential author, a Turkish intellectual, Ethem İzzet Benice, editor of popular newspapers such as Tevhid, Milliyet, Son Telegraph, he wrote an article about the Armenian and Greek community in which he declared, I quote, Armenian is Armenian, Greek is Greek. Certainly it is impossible that they become fellow Turkish citizens. No bite of Turkish bread passes through their throats without ingratitude. They prove this hundreds of times, thousands of times. There is no far or close distance between us. There is a cliff. Neither the constitution nor any power can eliminate this cliff and join our hands together. Their citizenship, their Turkishness, and the claim that they are the children of this country are nothing but fantasy and lies." End quote. As I outlined in this presentation, the travel ban imposed on the Istanbul Armenians in the very first years of young republic was perhaps the first blow to hope of civic nationalism that the Armenians expected from the Republican regime. Contrary to the idea of equality between citizens, this travel ban, was imposed only on ethnic Armenians, not even on Greeks or Jews. The state increased its authority over the Armenian schools through new regulations, and some publications, provocative publications targeting the Armenians in the Turkish press became chronic during the first decade of the Republic. Under these circumstances, the Armenian community leadership in Istanbul accommodated the repressive state policies, and there were no bold requests made by the community to ask for democratic citizenship rights in response to these full-scale nationalization steps taken by the state. So I want to conclude with a very interesting episode. Regarding the Armenian community during the Republican years. The 5th anniversary of the proclamation of the Republic of Turkey was celebrated throughout Anatolia and Istanbul in October 1928. In Istanbul, the celebrations, which were organized by the governorship, began in Beyazıt Square and saw military units and school bands marching to Taksim Square, passing through Divan Yolu, Sultanahmet, Sirkeci, Eminönü, and Şişhane neighborhoods. As the procession made its way through Sirkeci, both sides of the street were filled with spectators, and when the Armenian scouts of Üsküdar passed by, a voice shouted, "Yaşasın Ermeniler, long live Armenians." After a short silence, the whole crowd joined in, and the chorus repeating, "Yaşasın Ermeniler, long live Armenians," until the Armenian scouts disappeared from the view. This episode itself demonstrates the peculiarities of the relations between the wider Turkish society and the Armenian community during the first decades of the Republic of Turkey. The celebrations of the 5th anniversary of the Republic of Turkey was, quote-unquote, a loyalty check for the non-Muslims, and Armenian scouts of Üsküdar were applauded by the crowd because of their participation, which resembled their support to the Republican regime. Yet, as has been demonstrated in this paper, the Republican regime, assisted by Turkish intellectuals and the press, advanced its nationalist agenda during the early Republican years. Historical analysis of this period through the lens of Armenian and Ottoman Turkish papers offers insights into the precarious situation of Armenian community in early Republican years and provides an important historical background for the Turkish-Armenian relations. Thank you.